to create and grow income streams and manage, multiply, and protect your wealth in the new economy. Are you tired of trading your time for money? Do you desire freedom today instead of retirement in 10, 20, or 30 years? I'm MC Laubscher, and this is the Cashflow Ninja. Hello Cashflow Ninjas, MC Laubscher here, and welcome to another episode of the Cashflow Ninja. I have an incredible episode again for you, joined by special guest Ted Benna. Ted Benna is the creator of the 401k. Ted's been previously on the show. For more information or to listen to that show, go to cashflowninja.com and just type in Ted Benna and you'll find that previous episode. Ted, this is again such a pleasure to connect. Thank you so much for joining me on the show again.
Hey, MC, it's nice to catch up with you again, certainly.
Absolutely. I love that you lived in the area that I now lived in, and so you're very well familiar with with Newtown, with the town and all of the things that are happening in this area. Beautiful part of the world.
That I am.
Yep, absolutely. So where do you live now, Ted? Where's home?
Well, those of you who are baseball fans and are familiar with the Little League World Series, I'm not far from Williamsport, PA, which is up in north central Pennsylvania.
Gotcha. Fantastic. Well, I'm really excited to talk about a book that you wrote, 401k 40 years later. It's been quite a wild ride. What led you to write the book? What are some of the messages that you wanted to share in the book, and what's sort of the big forest picture before we get into the trees of the 401k 40 years later?
Well, actually, MC, this ties into kind of where we are today financially. 1995, I wrote a book titled Escaping the Coming Retirement Crisis. That was 1995, 25 years ago.
Yep.
And one of the major themes of that book was that when we were in this decade, that one of the major socioeconomic issues would be the intergenerational financial tension. The workers having to support the cost of the workers having to support the retirees, and certainly that's going to be a factor in this generation. But the one thing that I hadn't anticipated, which is also happening, is the generational tension that the older folks are having to support their children. The other
right.
side, both parts of it are in play. So, it's a dual generational tension. I wasn't expecting it kind of to be one way. And, so that leads into the 401k 40 years later book, when, I was kind of felt compelled to update the Escaping book. And so I, started drafting with that plan in mind. And, I got it drafted and then I left it on the shelf and didn't do anything with it. And then I was drawn back into, actually moving to get it out there and getting published. And as I was doing that, I realized that, well, golly, this is now the 40th anniversary of 401k. So I flipped the title of the book for that reason, but also, as I indicated in the opening of the book, I was afraid of the fact that if I used the Revisiting Escaping the Coming Retirement Crisis as a title, that people would think I was going to be giving them an answer, and I didn't have one to that.
Yep. Yeah, it's been quite incredible, and I appreciate you sharing too the intertension that you saw, and it is quite a situation that we're in demographically, where we have a massive amount of baby boomers now ready to retire, even the younger ones, right? About 76 million of them going into the retirement phase of their life. We've sort of got a couple of smaller groups in between, the generation that I find myself in, and then millennials, which is even bigger than the baby boomers. But it's a little bit of a different world financially and from a societal structure. And as you mentioned, some of the boomers, they're now finding themselves in a situation where they've got a lot of children living at home with them. And parents, right? They've been referred to as sort of the sandwich generation. Now, Ted, you found or saw an opportunity in the tax code that was created to establish a vehicle to support business owners and companies at that point. Can you talk us a little bit through the thinking, and just at the time when you saw this opportunity that was presented to you in the tax code rather, to eventually establish the 401k vehicle as we know it today?
Yeah, MC, I was a math major, so I'm an analytical type guy, and I was a consultant. So, hey, my motivation when I was doing this was, hey, I was married, had 4 young children, and a mortgage, and all that responsibility. So, it was all about making a living. All right, because I'm been asked, different times, well, were you trying to create this wonderful retirement thing or whatever? All I was doing was I was hired by a Philadelphia area bank to redesign their retirement program. And 401k is one of a number of creative things I was able to do in my career. And, the creativity happened when I had an assignment and I had to come up with an answer that I was, being paid to do. And, that's what happened in this particular instance. They were looking to replace a cash bonus program with a deferred retirement program known as a cash deferred profit sharing arrangement. And, as I was in that process, I had experience with those types of plans, and they had been in limbo, for a number of years legislatively. And what happened was in 1978, finally, Congress passed legislation creating a new framework for the operation of these plans. But, January 78 came and went. Nobody was really running around setting up 401k plans because it wasn't expected to be a big deal, MC. And so it was in the fall of 1979, actually, that I was working on this project and realized that this section of the code would enable me to provide an answer to what the bank wanted to accomplish. But one of the key things was, in order to make it work well, we had to get a sufficient level of participation from the lower paid 2/3 of the employees. And I knew a tax break alone wasn't going to be sufficient to do that. So that was when I came up with the idea of adding a matching employer contribution. And, there wasn't anything in this particular piece of legislation adding this paragraph to the IRS code that said that you could do that. The other thing I quickly realized was this also provided an opportunity for employees to make pre-tax contributions out of their own pay. But there wasn't anything there saying you could do that either. But there wasn't anything saying thou shalt not. So, I chose to take the more aggressive interpretation, MC.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was established and put together. Well, one of the things that we spoke about in our previous conversation too, this was never designed to turn into this behemoth that you had you had designed it for. And I know that there's some interviews that you've done on this too, but maybe if you could just touch on that this wasn't supposed to be the be all and end all of retirement savings and planning for retirement, but it was to supplement a lot of what folks were already doing and planning for retirement.
Yeah, that's correct. And, I did a podcast a couple of days ago, and the guy I did that for had interviewed, I forget his first name, Stringer, was a young attorney out of Temple Law School who actually drafted this section of the code. And I was a math major out of Temple University, so Temple played a big role in this, as it turned out. But he was asked, what the expected revenue impact was, and had said, it was only $1 million. It wasn't expected to be a big deal at all. And so clearly this turned into, well, this is one of the the amazing things politically. It didn't happen because we had some member of Congress say, "Hey, why don't we create this thing? It's going to revolutionize the retirement business." And this is what turned the mutual fund companies into what the monster they are today, size-wise. MC, I mean, they were pretty much small mom and pop operations, before 401k, and kind of interesting. Vanguard, obviously, in that area is one of the they are, I think, the largest at this point, and their CEO, who's well known for pioneering, the index funds, Mr. He didn't like 401k. He was never a fan of them, Mr. Vogel.
Yeah, it's quite interesting how many things have happened just in Pennsylvania that has impacted and affected the whole world. As you mentioned there, Professor Stringer with Temple University, you were a Temple grad out of there, living in the Newtown area where I live now. And then John Bogle created and started Vanguard, which is also started out of Pennsylvania. So a lot of things happening in Pennsylvania that truly impacted the world. It's quite astonishing when you put this all together. Yeah, one of the things that we also kind of mentioned was this was never designed to be the be-all and end-all for retirement savings. It was something that companies could use to supplement that of employees, and that there was other things in place too, right? So you had pensions, which was a very, very big driver and a very big part of retirement planning, which essentially I think that once this was created, and as you mentioned, the mutual fund companies really started to jump into this, there was now a huge stock market boom because many Americans that have never invested in the stock market before now was investing in the stock market through 401ks, and maybe corporations saw an opportunity to move some of the liabilities on their balance sheets, which were the pensions, the promises made in the future to pay folks, and move it over and put the responsibility squarely on that of their employees and take themselves out of the picture, right?
Yeah, MC, I started in the pension side of the business, and so I know the history of what's happened, and I've covered that in the book.
Yeah.
Detailed the reasons why pension plans have actually failed, and that would have happened whether 401k ever existed or not. 401k, and I don't care if people want to blame it on 401k. It's no big deal to me. But the reality is it would have been happening whether 401k ever came to be or not. And interestingly, again, politically here, one of the major reasons for the death of pension plans is a piece of legislation known as ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, and its purpose was to shore up the pension system financially. And it takes getting into more detail than we have time to do, and I've covered it in the book as to why it's one of the major reasons for the death of these plans. And so here's an example again where legislation that was enacted caused the opposite to happen long term than what was intended. And so that's important to keep in mind as we're messing around with these pieces of legislation that are happening now too. You never know what how in the world they're going to play out longer term.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's many forces here, maybe you can touch on that too, that is creating this retirement crisis. You had mentioned that there's a lot of tension just between the generations, right? Because there's a massive generation that's going into retirement and now selling off assets to fund retirement, so houses, stocks, and so forth. And when you have this enormous amount of folks and a group of people selling stuff, and there's not necessarily a big enough group coming in behind them that are able to buy it, and the millennials have different buying habits too as opposed to the baby boomers, that's already going to create a market imbalance. So you've got that going on. I'm a big believer in personal responsibility and taking responsibility and owning everything that we do ourselves. So I think also, to your point, pointing fingers as just vehicles isn't going to cut it for me. I think that collectively, not just people in the United States, but globally, we have just not done a good enough job to make money a priority, to make savings a priority, and to make to plan for the future, right? To think long term and long range instead of just very, very, very short term. And then, as you mentioned, the 401ks has a lot of faults which people are now understanding, and because they've made this the primary one, and then obviously you've touched on pensions, so it's almost like this perfect storm coming together. Maybe if you have some comments on that and just want to elaborate on some pieces of that I just mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I go into these things in more detail in the book, but
Yep.
the first one is that book came out 18 months ago now, and one of the things I was warning individuals approaching retirement or who were already retired was that they probably had much higher level of risk than what they should. And the problem here when you're in that stage of life is you need to be a lot more defensive in protecting what you have than concerned about maximizing your return. And what the traditional financial advisor types have done is, they've had these portfolios, as that have major risk in the stock and bond market. And, the idea being that, well, don't get excited when it drops by 30-40%, it'll come back. Well, that's fine, when you're in your 30s, your 40s, or maybe your early 50s, and you're continuing to invest for quite a few years because you're obviously now buying new shares at a substantial discount. But the problem is reverse when you're retired, because now you're having to liquidate shares. So what happens is when those shares drop by 30% in value, you've got to sell 30% more shares than what you otherwise would have had to do to generate the same income. So you got the reverse working against you during your retirement. Now the other is working over to the pension side. MC, there's people don't realize it, but they have as much investment risk in pension plans as they do in 401ks. They just don't know it. And so many of the, what has happened historically is pension type systems, whether they're Social Security, they're state or local governments, or they're private employers, have legally forever been able to promise benefits that are not properly funded. So what happens is you think you have a guaranteed benefit for life that you can't lose, but that's not the reality. If you're in those programs, you have substantial risk. And again, one of the things I pointed out in the book is if you're in a plan, a private employer or let's say a state-run plan, where you have the opportunity when you retire to take significant cash out of those programs, for sure you should do that. And definitely, at this point in time, because the funding status of those plans are becoming much worse than what they were before this economic problem we've run into.
MC Laubscher, the creator of the Cashflow Ninja and Cashflow Coach at Producers Wealth, where we help our clients integrate infinite banking with their business and investments. To learn how you can create your own banking system to turbocharge your investments and business in 30 days or less, go to yourownbankingsystem.com. That's yourownbankingsystem.com.
Yeah, it's another one of those vehicles that was designed with good intentions, and it seemed it completely went a different route with a lot of fees, a lot of people having their hands in that cookie jar, if you will. And then also, I think, and I know that you had mentioned from a math standpoint too, how this basically the expectations of returns in this, or what it was and what the reality is, it just never ever met. So now you have all of these pension programs out there basically underfunded, and they just don't have the money to make do on the promises that they promised up front, right?
Yeah, and this had actually started to hit a few years ago. There specific plans, some of them municipal, but one of them I'll bring up specifically is the Eastern States Teamsters Fund. When President Obama was still in office, there was legislation enacted and amazingly signed by him that allowed the trustees of those programs to substantially cut the benefits because they're going to be running out of money. And so there's been a lot of political stress that most people don't know about the last few years in Congress over passing legislation to bail out the Teamsters pension and other funded systems as well. And that's before we ran into this bump in the road. So it's going to be a tough situation, definitely.
So it's almost like a perfect storm coming together with all of the many things that we mentioned, the demographics, market dynamics, people not planning long term, and then also the vehicles that was basically all they had available, whether it was a 401k or pensions, that are now a lot of the market dynamics play into that. But there's no money in pensions, and then also with the 401ks. We also see what's happening, currently to a lot of retirement savings and how it's structured, that this perfect storm is sort of coming together for a massive retirement crisis.
Yeah, and one of the things that's happened, unfortunately, is there's been abuse. And I'm talking about employee abuse of the pension system. We've seen it in the, police and fireman plans are examples, and so also in the education system that, what happened is plans are originally set up, initially to provide a reasonable pension or retirement, have been abused by changing the legislation so that the benefits are based on your income immediately prior to retirement. So what has happened, in the police and firemen as examples, is when something catastrophic happens like 9/11 did, and you have tons of overtime, man, you have an opportunity, if you're of retirement age, to jump out at that point and lock in a much higher pension than otherwise would have been the case. You also got abused by individuals being promoted, in their last years to bump up their incomes to walk out with big pensions. I read not too long ago that in the education system in California, for example, there are thousands of retirees that have pensions that are being paid that exceed the maximum allowed, permitted by federal law, even to public, to private employees. They exceed the maximum. So the state and the school system out there is having to pay as wages retirement benefits that go beyond the maximum pension limit. They're having to pay it out as compensation.
Yeah.
So it's pretty, it's crazy. I mean, it's really pretty wild.
Yep. There's a lot of, the same thing I would say during the last financial crisis, with the focus being on housing. There's a lot of things that happened on many sides of the table, right? People that borrowed money that they really shouldn't have borrowed, and buying properties and houses that they shouldn't have bought, and then the lending institutions lending it to them that they knew these borrowers probably are not going to be able to pay back. The same thing, with these vehicles, if you really look down, there's a lot of things done on a lot of sides of the table, which just contributes to the overall big picture problem, this massive problem and crisis that we have in front of us. Maybe if you have any comments on that, and I also want to touch a little bit on the second part of the book too, where you do give some examples to become and how people can become retirement ready.
Well, I don't have a whole lot, to say right now. The people who have taken the big hit. I don't know what to tell them, MC. If all of a sudden you're retired and your nest eggs, shrunk by 30%. I don't know whether to tell you to hang in or to cash out, because it still may get worse. It's a tough issue, and there aren't easy answers.
Yeah.
It bothered me. Told my son this not long ago. We were seeing a lot of articles about 401k millionaires, and more of them than ever. And what concerned me about that we had the same thing going into the 2008 blow up. I get calls from financial writers who would say, "Hey, do you know any 401k millionaires? We'd like to interview them." And and that was not long before busted in 2008. And so when that noise, was out there again this time, I thought, well, that's a sign we must be getting close to the end here where this bubble is going to burst, because the perception with that kind of thinking is that, generally it's fairly easy. You save a bit of money, you've invested in a, good mutual fund, and before you know it, you're a millionaire. And, as you and I both know, you're a lot better off, to diversify, to be smarter than what you're doing, to not have everything kind of tied up into one little basket, and, be pretty broadly diversified.
Yeah, and absolutely, and have a strategy. I think one of the things, and to your point, a lot of this is marketing, right? And that's media. Media needs to drive eyeballs to their content so that they serve their advertisers, right? So you're going to get a lot of sensational stories out there. We've spoken on the show too of what a disservice a lot of the media does to entrepreneurs, because you read stories about, oh, this guy quit his job and started a company in his garage, and now he's a multi-millionaire. Doesn't really go like that, as you know. It doesn't really work like that. There's a lot of things that are not shared in there. So no, absolutely, the sensationalism, but back to the overall strategy and diversifying. It's important to have a strategy and not just be vehicle and product focused. That's how we market it to. We're marketed to, you have to buy this mutual fund, you have to buy this. Where does this all fit into an overall strategy? And if you have several vehicles doing different things as part of your strategy for you, then if one of the vehicles, let's just say, takes a really big significant hit, like in this case the 401ks or even the pensions, which will be reduced for the majority of people if they do get money out there, then at least there's other things in your strategy which you can rely and fall back on.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind, it ties back into, why did we leave the Newtown, Bucks County area? We did that when we were in our later 50s, MC, and what was happening was, we had a big house there, and we're paying substantial taxes, and the school district was talking about building another $100 million of schools, and our children hadn't settled in the area. We didn't have any reason to stay in that area, and so we were relocated to an area where we were able to reduce our living costs by about 50%.
Yep.
So it's one of the things I would say to those who are coming up to retirement sometime in the not too distant future. One of the things that you definitely need to be thinking about is where you're going to live and how you're going to live, as you move into your retirement years. Geographically, should you relocate potentially? Should you downsize in terms of your housing? And, for many average individuals, their home is one of their major assets that they have. And, there are times when, they need to consider perhaps, shifting gears and, getting the equity out of that, and, so that it can produce income for them. And I've worked with widows on that situation different times over the years, MC, where, they'll have a house and it's paid off, and it doesn't, they're in their mind, it doesn't cost anything. And so I'll say to them, okay, well, just put down on paper how much you're paying for taxes, for, maintenance, all the other things, that you have, even though you don't have a mortgage. Put it down on paper, and it's maybe into the tens of thousands of dollars, depending on how big, the property is. Uh, and so you need income. You don't need an asset that actually draws income away from you, to maintain it. So certainly, that's something that needs to be considered here is, for those who are going to be heading into the retirement years.
Absolutely, as you mentioned, and we've spoken on the show too. Your return on home equity is always zero. It's not paying you. So if you can turn that into income and restructure where you live and find a different place to live and utilize some of that equity, you can use that to create income, which fuels retirement. And that is another piece of the puzzle that I didn't even include in the perfect storm, where if we're looking at just what's happening right now, not to get into really into the crisis that we're experiencing right now, but large unemployment numbers that are coming out in the United States, and it looks like that's going to be a trend for a while, unfortunately, as this economic crisis sort of picks up momentum and steam, is going to contribute and really hit the housing market pretty hard too, where a lot of folks have their savings either, they were really, really bargaining on having a 401k, a pension, and if even, and then also their primary residence, which they utilize as a savings vehicle. So it's very important to understand and navigate this storm and make adjustments and moves and pivot while you still can, right, Ted?
Well, absolutely, and the housing market is going to be an issue. Your ability to sell might be tough, and it might be substantially lower. But if you're relocating into a much significantly lower cost area and smaller property, it still may be advantageous to consider doing that even in a tougher market.
Yep, absolutely. Absolutely. I want to change gears here for a second, because you were involved in a lot of other things too during your career. One of the things that I've spoken about on the show.
Life settlement investments have allowed financial and banking institutions to not only buy their equity contractually, but also diversify their capital from any economic, market, and geopolitical risk. It's been part of the billion-dollar blueprint followed by institutional investors. And if you're an accredited investor, you can also now participate in this vehicle with enormous growth potential. You can watch an informational webinar presented by one of the premier organizations providing life settlement investments, Benna Solutions, at cashflowninja.com/life settlements.
And what my firm does too is specialize in overfunding life insurance vehicles, which provides a lot of guarantees and a lot of certainty and a lot of security as part of an overall strategy. We have mentioned how corporations utilize these vehicles too, and not only are you very knowledgeable on corporate-owned life insurance, COLI as it's known, but you were one of the folks creating a lot of these programs and was right there at the beginning. Maybe if you can start, if you just want to touch on what corporate-owned life insurance is and how corporations benefit utilizing this within their strategies.
MC, we were involved in our firm and doing, compensation planning as well as retirement and healthcare. And so in our compensation practice, we work with some major corporations, in helping structure their compensation. And this is one of the areas I mentioned earlier, that ERISA was one of the reasons for the death of pension plans. And I have to go into a little bit of detail here on this one. Before ERISA was passed, there weren't any maximum benefit pension benefits. No limits, okay, on the size of corporate pensions. And so when we were working with banks and with public companies at that time on their pensions and redesigning and encouraging them to increase pension benefits, the CEO and CFO and HR director would want to know, hey, personally, how are we going to benefit from this? Because most of their financial security in those companies was tied to the pension plan, just like the rank and file employees. Now, what happened when maximum caps were put on, and we began to break that linkage, And now there isn't any linkage at all. So going back, to my days when we were working with Coley, what happened is we were helping public companies set up what were called non-qualified pension arrangements for their senior execs. And by using Coley, they could give the execs gigantic payouts and present it in the marketplace as having minimal impact on earnings, like pennies per share.
Mm-hmm.
So you could give a senior exec 100 million potential payout package, in these contracts, which we see, with little impact on earnings by leveraging off Coley. And what the corporate loan life insurance would do is it would enable the corporation ultimately to do what's called cost recovery, recover the cost of that fat contracts via corporate-owned life insurance that came in tax-free once the executive died.
Very interesting stuff. So for our listeners and viewers out there that this is the first time that they're familiar with it, the overfunded life insurance contracts can essentially provide, as you mentioned, a quote-unquote private pension because it gets someone a tax-free distribution at a certain age if it's structured correctly. And how it was utilized by the corporations is the corporations would actually be the owner of the life insurance policy. The insured would be the executive. For that this plan is set up. They would fund these policies for them. The executives would then go in retirement and have a predictable or a certain tax-free income stream, and when eventually the executive passes away, then the company would be made whole because the death benefit would be paid tax-free to the corporations.
Yeah, well, actually, MC, in the corporate structure here was a little bit different.
Yeah.
So rather than using these building up high cash values, that happened more in the banking business. In the regular corporate, what happened was we were able to structure policies where if they paid only 4 out of 7 of the first years of premium, they could then run the policies forever without paying any more premium and get tax deductions at the corporate level for the interest that they was accruing on these policies.
Yeah.
So it's tax leverage actually off the policy loans. And then what would happen is when the individual retired, rather than actually getting paid from the policy, the corporation would pay out their 100 million or 10 million a year or whatever it was. It would actually be cash out of the corporation. But when the executive died, the corporation was the owner of, let's say, $100 million life insurance policy. The proceeds at death came back in tax-free to the corporation.
Yep.
Now, this is, by the way, also a factor in how athletes are getting paid the huge contracts that they're getting paid, because the owners are doing the same thing. They're buying these huge corporate type life insurance policies, to do what's called cost recovery when these individuals die. And this is how it was actually discovered that Johnson had AIDS, for the Lakers, Magic Johnson.
Yep.
He was tested for a life insurance exam. He was, getting a new contract, and the insurance exam turned up the fact that he had AIDS.
Yep. Yeah, it's very interesting. If you Google and search online for, Jeffrey Immel, GE, life insurance contract. If you Google Jim Harbaugh, for example, the University of Michigan, life insurance, there was an article on ESPN. So a lot of folks would see this and just kind of just click to the next article, basically, because it has the word life insurance in it. But this, to your point, is a very big strategy for a lot of corporations and a lot of professional sports franchises in structuring these packages, and also a big part of their overall strategy for cost recovery.
Interesting stuff.
Yeah, that's why you keep on learning, and there's so many different ways to do it, and it's very, very interesting. You mentioned, and I know this is a different niche, but this is also done a lot by banks. It's called bank-owned life insurance, Bowie. We won't get into that, but that's also a very, very big part of that strategy. So definitely very interesting stuff. Ted, where can folks get a copy? Sorry, go ahead.
Before we shift, there's just something else that came to mind that I think is worth throwing in here. And
absolutely.
But politically, I'm not a big fan of anybody. All right, so this isn't a comment against any party or individual or whatever. But there's a lot of concern, and rightly so now, about the disparity between the huge gap at the income versus the lower levels. It's just gotten larger and larger. And actually what we're talking about was a factor in driving that. When the ceiling was put on pensions, which broke the link in terms of the financial security of the senior exec, and the average employees, that's why we've morphed into where we've morphed. And so it's an example again where tax policy actually ran amok and drove this, that the idea was, well, we're not going to allow the corporations huge deductions in funding big pensions for senior execs. We'll put a limit on it. So what happened is, hey, the senior execs took care of themselves, and this is the other way that they accomplished it, and it's ultimately just created a much bigger gap. And I missed one point earlier that ties into this, that having a pension plan then became a risk for the payoffs of senior execs, because one of their biggest payoffs typically was stock options and driving up the price of stock. And having a pension plan, without getting buried into the details, actually created financial risk, because the unpredictable cost that a pension plan has, an impact on earnings. So pretty goofy stuff.
That is super interesting what you just said, and it's a sort of like, boo, it just like it became an aha moment for me too, because you mentioned that the interests were always aligned by the people at the top, the corporate execs, and then everyone in the company, because they were all in the pension plan together. And not only did the link break with ERISA, where there was a cap put on executive, for the execs for their pensions, but it's almost now, they're now at odds with each other, because the liability on the books of the company impacts the overall performance of the company and the stock price, which is, based on what these guys, a lot of the way that their contracts are structured is how they make their money and how they get paid, right?
Yep.
Yeah. Very, very interesting stuff and very insightful. So I appreciate you sharing that. And as you mentioned, that has played a massive role in this sort of, this kind of like this unequal distribution of income, basically just in corporate America. It's very insightful. Yeah, so Ted, where can folks learn more about the book? Where can they grab a copy of this book, 401k 40 Years Later? Very interesting read.
It's available through the normal markets, including Amazon, and you can Kindle it so you can get a safe version.
Yes, at the time right now of recording, it's pretty tough to get non-essential things shipped. But this is available on Kindle if you want to grab a copy of it through your Kindle and online. You will be able to do so. Ted, as always, really enjoy our conversations, and there's always a lot that I learn. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing your journey and your knowledge again with all of my listeners and my viewers. Appreciate you.
Okay, well, all the best to you and your listeners, MC.
This presentation is for educational and informational purposes only. The information being presented and considered does not consider your particular financial objectives or situation, and it does not make personalized recommendations. This material is not intended to replace the advice of a qualified tax and legal advisor or other qualified professionals, and you should not use the information in place of a customized consultation with a licensed professional regarding your specific personal financial objectives, situation, and needs. We believe the information provided is reliable, but we do not guarantee its accuracy, timeliness, or completeness.